Oh, my pleasure. Hi, everybody. Love being here. This is just a great series. Many of you know that I do the moth, right? A lot of times. And whenever you do the moth, Dusty Rhodes, who's a crazy kind of MC, but she's good. She's an English teacher and she means well. She stands up and she tells the entire crowd of hundreds of people some of the instructions about what makes a good story. The first thing she says is, I know that many of you think you know what a beginning, middle, and end are, but you're wrong. You don't. I've been doing this for years and none of you know. And of course, people laugh, but what they don't know is that she's serious and she's right. Because most people really don't know how to effectively incorporate a beginning, a middle, and an end. Um, and this is a challenging feature, I think, not just for new storytellers, but for all of us. I know that I struggle with it many, many times. And tonight, our master teller is Dr. Fran Stallings, who will guide us on the basics of narrative structure, including elements of beginning, middle, and end, and will show us how to use story mapping and brainstorming to get there. Fran lives in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. And if you know Fran, then you know one of the best and most versatile storytellers in these parts. One of the reasons she was a featured teller at our TSA festival in 2024. Fran is often invited to tell traditional and original stories nationwide and overseas. Her repertoire includes environmental, folk, and fact oriented tales and Japanese folk tales. Dr. Stallings is a recipient of TSA's prestigious John Henry Falk Award and two oracles from the National Storytelling Network. Fran has a PhD in botany and claims that's another story. And her bio is far more extensive than what I'm doing right now, and she's worth talking to and looking up. But in the meantime, let's get started. Fran, you've got the floor.
Thank you so much. Or it's always handy to put a chair on. In the curriculum that's mandated for Oklahoma second graders, beginning, middle, and end are some of the, literally, they're called story elements that are required for those kids to understand. And so we're going to be talking about those. We're going to be talking about chronological, traditional story structure and alternate forms of stories. But I hope by now, we've been Zooming since everything shut down due to COVID way back in the year, what was 2020? Good grief. So I hope you know how to handle this thing.
Oh, way better. Yep, it looked gone.
And you know how to mute yourself. Um, if you have questions about something, use the chat. There's a thing down at the bottom of your screen that will open the chat panel so you can write a chat. And then while you guys are in breakout rooms, I'll have a chance to read the questions that are in the chat, and I'll be able to see what may need to be expanded or explained further, etc. I'll also use the chat sometimes to post in some resource references that you might want, so you know how to save the chat so you can have it later. Another feature that we'll use down at the bottom is that heart-shaped logo. If you see it, it's called React, and when you click on it, a number of options come up, but I'll be using the one that says raise hand, because when you click on that, see there's a little hand came up in the corner of my screen. And also when I look at you in gallery view, that will move the pictures around, the thumbnails around, so that all the people with a hand up are up in one corner and I can see how many people want to answer a particular thing. Breakout rooms, I hope you've been in those before. I'll explain more about how that works. But you see, because we're not in person, and I want you to work in a workshop. So I've programmed a lot of small group activities, and they'll be done in breakout rooms since we can't just move our chairs and sit knee to knee. So, okay, let me see if I can get this good old thing to start with some slides. I made some slides and I hope they will show. Let's see, this is such fun. There we go. Okay. So this is our workshop on story structure. And what is that? That's not what I wanted. Good grief. There we are. Here's the next one. Um, your name, where you live, and what kinds of stories you tell. If we were in person, I would ask you to raise your hands about what kinds of stories you tell. But since this is a workshop and I want you to work, I need you to start talking right away. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to put you in breakout rooms, and in the breakout room, you will get to um, you'll get to introduce yourself to the others in your room. And I don't want it to be your entire life story. I'm going to model that. Your very brief introduction will be, mine is, I am Fran Stallings. I live in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, which is in the northeast corner of the state, practically Missouri. And I tell folk tales, fairy tales, lots of different kinds of traditional stories, a few literary, but I'm also doing more and more original stories that I've put together from family memories and from history and science. So that, what, 60 seconds? Less than that, I think. Thank you, everybody. I hope you all had a chance to talk, get your vocal cords fired up, and talk a little bit about yourself, because it's been my experience sometimes when we have breakout rooms starting right away with a particular task that storytellers have to talk about themselves first anyway.
Well,
I listened in a bit and I heard that some people tell folk tales and fairy tales, and I like to call those I like to call those existing stories. Um, the stories that come to us. Try using the hand raise thing under React. I'm curious how many people tell stories of that kind: folk tales, fairy tales,
mm.
myths, legends, ghost story, or you can use the hand raising thing. Or how about, well, we got a few people know how to do that.
Mhm.
Okay. And other people are just raising a hand in the camera. Okay. Thank you. And you can put your hands down. You know how to do that. That's under
I gotta catch up with
the
myself.
same React logo. And then other people said that they're working on family stories, personal stories, stories based on
Mhm.
history or other things that they had to research themselves. And those are stories that we have to shape ourselves. It's it's an extra task. You're not just telling the story, you have to create it. And so it takes a slightly different approach. Let me get my, oh darn,
Mm.
there. Okay. These are what I call existing tales, the ones that come to us already made. The structure that they have works because whenever some upstart of a troubadour or poet decided to try telling the story a little bit differently, the next generation maybe couldn't remember that. And so the stories that already exist have a structure. They're worth studying, even if you're not all that interested in folk tales or fairy tales as something you want to tell yourself. It's important to study them to see how they're put together because they work. If they didn't work, they wouldn't have come down to us. Now, literary tales come to us, and sometimes when we get permission, they say, don't change a word. and you have to stay with that. So the structure is given to you. And please mute if you're not speaking, because otherwise we get confused when dogs start to bark and other things happen. And then they're what I call crafted stories, and those are the ones where we have to create the structure. It didn't come to us. And with personal and family stories, we rack our brains for memories, we interview people in order to pile up the facts. With history and biography, science stories, my environmental stories, we go to the library, we go online and research piles and piles of information, of facts, but then what do you do with them? I saw something one time that said facts are just a lot of bricks lying around. A story is where you make them mean something by building something meaningful out of them. And the same rule applies to original fiction. You can create the characters, you can create the setting and the future or past world and so forth, but you still have to have a structure that makes the story go. Who, what, when, where, why? Did you get that in high school English class when they did a unit on journalism? That's where I first heard of the 5 W's. And the point was hammered in that a reporter has to cover these 5 questions in a story because that's what people are looking for when they read the story or when our listeners listen for a story. These are the questions that we want answered. And I think it's true that human beings listen to things, and if they're in story form, it fits. I think there must be slots in our brains somewhere that are story shaped. If it's story shaped, it'll fit. If it doesn't fit, those facts get lost. Any good trial lawyer knows that, and they shape the story accordingly. I think the beginning is where we hear about the who and what, the who and where and when. So that, for instance, well, let's take a traditional story. Once there was a little girl with golden hair, and she knew perfectly well that when she went for a walk in the forest, she must not knock on strangers' doors and go into strangers' houses. Her mother had told her so. But one day, this is what happened in this story. And you know the story about Goldilocks and the house that she went into because she was hungry and thirsty and just barged in. The end of the story will tell us, well, some stories really pile up at the end, and people have tagged these moral of the story onto Aesop's stories. And so, let me see, and so warmth is more powerful than force, or something like that. But I think in a less didactic way, the end of the story tells us why we should care that we've heard this. Why did all of this stuff go on? And yes, okay. And why was it worth listening to? Going into this in a little bit more detail. The beginning of a story introduces the information, the who, where, and when. It also sets a tone. I know Diane Cox tells a beautiful story about her parents meeting during World War II. And she starts by singing one of the songs that was popular then, and that sets a mood, and then she can begin to tell the story. The beginning of a story can grab listeners' attention so that, for instance, why did the monkey cross the road? To get to the other side, except sometimes they don't make it. That's the beginning of a story I've developed recently about a biologist in Brazil who worked with indigenous tribes in developing ways for monkeys to safely get across the road instead of ending up as roadkill. But the beginning of the story grabs your attention, makes you wonder, what are you going to hear? And also, a good, smooth beginning assures listeners that they're in good hands. If you come onto stage or to the microphone and say, "Well, I'm just starting to work on this, and I'm not quite sure how it's going to go, and I hope I'll remember," people just groan and roll their eyes. But if you can step up and say, "Once there was," all of a sudden, people know that they can probably relax and just listen. I don't memorize my stories, the texts of my stories, but if I try to really work out anything that is smooth and prepared, it's going to be the opening sentences because I want to be able to push off the hill and get rolling in that way. The middle of the story tells what happens. Now, I was very annoyed when English teachers said, "Oh, what's the conflict?" Because, you look at a lot of perfectly good stories and there's no fight, there's no conflict, but there might be a problem. Well, it might bring up an ethical conflict. Something is at stake. Maybe something gained might be lost. Maybe somebody's feelings might be hurt if they don't understand. There has to be something at stake to make us care about what's going on. Another English teacher thing was rising and falling action. Well, we'll talk more about that. And I think the scholars say that the middle of the story is the resolution. The action is over. The hero has come home. The dam will not break, whatever. But that's not real. It's not quite the end. By this point, listeners want to know, has anything changed? Did they find what they were looking for? Did they learn anything? And the end is where you let listeners know that it's over. Why was this worth hearing? 2 years ago, when I shared the stage with Donald Davis, I remembered a time that he had come to Texas years earlier and he did a workshop. And I asked him about his story form because he is such a master. This is someone you should listen to. If you can get the recordings, listen and study to Donald in 20 minutes. He can do a beautiful job. He opens the story and you hear about characters and settings, and after a while I begin to wonder, why am I hearing this? And then all of a sudden something is at stake, and then it resolves and he closes it off so neatly. And I asked him, how do you come up with these neat closures that are so good, that really seal it up? And he didn't answer my question, but he did say something else interesting about letting listeners know that it's over. If you're reading a novel, you can see that you're running out of pages toward the end. So when the end comes, it's not a surprise. If you're watching television, you can glance at the clock. Very likely the program will be over on the hour or on the 30-minute point. Well, allowing 5 or 10 minutes for ads. You can anticipate when the ending is coming, but in an orally told story, you have to have a way of running it down, of bringing people home, of letting them know that it's safe to go back outside. And if there was something worth the telling in the story, if you have a closing comment to close it off neatly, that is a very good time to put it. I'm going to stop the sharing right now and let's see. Okay. Hester has a hand up. Is this something we all want to hear about?
Yes,
Yes.
thank you so much. One of the things that you have just solidified for me is I was just sharing with Carol in the breakout room. On two occasions, I've done a story. Both of them I consider big stories. I will start out with a song, and I end the story with the same song. And I'm very hard on myself, I do have to admit. And I was thinking, but is that storytelling, me coming out with a song? I didn't know that. I thought a story is supposed to start and end with a story. But today, you right now, you said someone come out yeah, the young lady came
Well,
out with a story about her
that's
parents.
one way of
And I
doing it.
and yeah, and immediately I said, thank you. I'm on
Okay.
the right track. But to give you real quickly a little snippet of it, is a civil rights story. It's my personal story, and come out with the song. I come out with "Keep Your Eyes on the Prize." So to me, that's my setup for the story.
Very good. I wish
Okay,
you had come to my workshop at the Texas Festival earlier in the month. It was about using music in storytelling.
wow,
And
and
that's a
yeah.
that's another topic for someone to do in this series. But let's get back to story format.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I just want to
Thank you.
thank you for
I'm
that.
so glad that comment was something that you needed to hear right now.
Mhm.
And that'll be wonderful. What I wanted to do with you is to practice listening to a story that I hope is well formed, and listen for the beginning and the middle and the end in a traditional story. And I'm going to tell a story that comes from Burma. It's called Myanmar now. And that might be relevant to the way some things are going these days. So I'm going to tell the story, and as you listen, listen for where's the beginning, the who, where, and when, where does the action start, and then how does the action close off at the end. Long ago, they say, the lion was the king of the jungle, and as king, he did everything himself. He believed in micromanaging. He didn't want to trust anyone else. He made all the decisions. He outlined everything for everyone to do, and he was exhausted. He was so tired. Sometimes he couldn't even sleep at night with all these things buzzing in his head, and he realized he needed help. A minister of state would be good. Someone to whom I could delegate, and they could do some of the work and make some of the decisions, but it would have to be someone I could trust, someone who was completely loyal. So he sent out a proclamation, advertised for people who were candidates as Minister of State to come and take a test, a loyalty test that he would, of course, supervise himself. You may not be surprised that only 3 of the jungle animals came to this test: the bear, the monkey, and the rabbit. Now, Bear was big and strong, was respected by everyone for his integrity and his honesty. Lion said, Bear, step forward, smell my breath, and tell us what you smell. And Bear innocently stepped forward, took a deep smell, and staggered back and said, Oh, sire, that is terrible. Such corruption. It smells like garbage. It smells like sewers. Please close your mouth. And Lion said, Bear, speaking this way of your king is treason, and the punishment for treason is death. And rah! That was the end of Bear. Well, of course, Monkey had been watching. Monkey was not famous for size and strength, but for a quick wit. And so when Lion said, Monkey, step forward, smell my breath, and tell us what you smell, Monkey danced forward, pretended to smell, and danced back to a safe distance and said, Sire, that was lovely. It was like roses and lilies, such a beautiful perfume. I wish we all could anoint ourselves with this fragrance. And Lion said, Monkey, you lie. And the punishment for lying, which is treason. The punishment for treason is death. And that was the end of Monkey. Well, the only one left was Rabbit, known neither for size and strength nor for cleverness, but Rabbit had relatives everywhere, and that is an advantage in politics. Very well, Rabbit. Step forward, smell my breath, and tell us what you smell. But Rabbit said, Sire, I'm, I'm so terribly sorry. I have a terrible cold in my nose. Lion said, Oh, well, then go home, go to bed, take care of yourself, and come back when you can smell. And so Rabbit went home and packed and left the country. And the thing is that in Burma, in old Burma, I am told, this story was so widely known that if ever you were asked a trick question and you knew you were going to be in trouble, whether you answered yes or no, up or down, it was at one time at least permissible to say, I'm terribly sorry. I have a cold in my nose. So you heard the beginning, setting up Lion and his situation. You heard the middle with the three different candidates coming, and then the end of the story. That is a traditional story, and it's told chronologically. But the fact is that not all stories have to be told beginning and then middle and then end. Imagine how you might take a story that you know and change the order around. Do you have to start at the absolute beginning? Or could you, for instance, I think you'll recognize this story. Well, you never know. You never know how fast you can run until you've got bears chasing after you. I'll tell you how that happened, and that might be starting at the end of Goldilocks, and then it's called Hook and Backfill. Or you might try, um, it was so comfortable under the eiderdown quilt. Poor old Goldilocks. She'd had a bad fall from that breaking chair, and now at last, even though her mouth was a little bit burned from the hottest porridge, at least her tummy was full, and she was just falling asleep when that's starting in the middle of the story. You can play around with familiar stories by starting at a different point. But although it can work, and even in the olden days, when Homer told the story of the Odyssey, he didn't start at the beginning with the war and then Odysseus trying this and this and this for 20 years to get home. No, he started 20 years in with Odysseus stuck on Calypso's island and Penelope, the story, Penelope back home fighting off all of those suitors, and their son, Telemachus, was that his name? Trying to get rid of the suitors and take his father's place as king. So even then, people started in the middle of things. In media res is what the scholars call it. But think about your audiences. Who do you tell stories to? Think about, would they be comfortable following you through starting in the middle, especially if it's a story they've never heard before? Now, it's one thing to do it with Goldilocks and the Three Bears. But think about the stories, your original crafted stories. You have to keep in mind how much they need to know in order to follow the story, how sharply they're going to be listening to you in order to figure out what's going on and what you've done, and um, whether they can keep track of it. But let's do a little experiment. I'm going to put you into breakout rooms, and I want you to think of a familiar story, a story that you and your colleagues would probably recognize. And I keep lists of these stories that probably everybody would know. Of course, there's Goldilocks and the Three Bears, and there's the Three Pigs, and the Three Billy Goats Gruff. Those threes, they all probably know those. Little Red Riding Hood, Little Red Hen, Gingerbread Boy, Chicken Little. You all know those stories. And then there are the fairy tales, Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, Cinderella, all of those. Think of a story that you might be able to tell starting at the end or starting at the middle. And I'm going to give you a few minutes to talk it over, brainstorm with your buddies in a breakout room. Think of a familiar story. And let me see, I have to tell you, yeah, well, I'll give you 6 minutes. No, I'll give you 10 minutes so that you can come up with different ideas. Think of a story. If each one of you has a different one in mind, surprise the others with where you're starting with the story and play around with the story order. There you
There-
come back again.
Oh,
You've survived so far. I hope you had a chance to come up with some interesting angles on story approaches.
I think neither here. Thank
Diving in
you.
the middle or diving in at the end gives you a fresh approach to a traditional story. And for a reality-based story, it can sometimes, well, in journalism talk, apparently it's called hook and backfill. When you start at the end, and I'll give you an example from a kind of family story. Well, you may wonder why we keep that little clock up on the mantle, even though it hasn't run for years. Why do we keep the thing? Well, let me tell you about it. It made the run in 1889, and it ran for et cetera, et cetera. That's called hook and backfill. You use the hook to catch people's curiosity and wonder what is this about? What's going on? It could be as simple as well, the bears all have short tails now, but they didn't used to. They used to have beautiful long tails, and you can fill, but having started at the end, then you do have to go back in and fill in with the rest of the story structure and information so that you have all your people with you. What I want to tell you about next is a technique that works for many stories to understand the overall shape. Um, we're, uh, I'll give you a preview of this, and then we're going to have a 5-minute bio break because those of us who've been drinking tea probably need it. And then we'll come back and this is going to be about a method that was developed by an author named Kurt Vonnegut. Kurt Vonnegut, he fought in the Second World War. He was captured at the Battle of the Bulge. He lived through the firestorm in Dresden. He came home, married his high school sweetheart. He went to the University of Chicago. He was going to study anthropology. They had a 5-year program, and you would get an undergraduate degree and then a master's in anthropology, but you had to write a thesis. And they would not accept his thesis topic. He really wanted to talk about this, but let me see if I can give you a forecast of what we're going to do with that. takes a number of clicks to get up here. Here we are. This is what I'm going to want to show you. The Shapes of Stories by Kurt Vonnegut. He wanted to write a thesis about the fact that the shapes of stories were at least as valuable a part of a culture as their arrowheads and stuff like that. And he wanted to make a graph, an up down from good fortune to ill fortune, and a timeline of how all these good things might disappear and then be regained again. This is a way of graphing a kind of story map that we're going to talk about in more detail after our bio break. So I want to see you back here in 5 minutes, and we will go on with our program. Guys, I hope you've had a refreshing bio break, or maybe came up with something else to drink. And we're ready to go on to talk about a way of showing the structure of stories as Kurt Vonnegut learned how to graph. In the chat, I've put the link to a video of Vonnegut demonstrating that. He has a lot of different kinds of stories that he has outlined, and you can see some of the action is above the line and some is below the line. There are all these different things, and there's too much detail here to expect you to absorb it from a slide. I hate it when slides have so much text and so forth. So I'm going to do a different method. I'm going to use a whiteboard and try to imitate the way that Kurt Vonnegut drew the arrangements of his diagrams. I'm going to make a line, and this is going to go from good fortune to ill fortune. And then I'm going to make a line for a timeline. Oh, come on, I can make it even longer. Oh, well, that'll do. Yeah. Try again. All right. All right. There's a line. All right. And that goes from beginning of the story to the end, assuming that we are chronological here. And Vonnegut liked to show a variety of ways that a story could progress. For instance, if there was a guy who was just buzzing along with his life, and then all of a sudden he got in trouble, and his trouble got worse and worse, but he finally managed to get out of trouble, and he was at least as happy as he had been before. Vonnegut calls this a fellow falling in a hole, but it could be any kind of misfortune, losing a financial fortune, getting ill, etc., etc. Let's try another one that he was very fond of. For instance, a boy meets a girl. Oh, she's perfect. We'll be happy forever and ever. But then there's a misunderstanding and they break up until finally they get reconnected and they are happy ever after. That's the plot of so many Hallmark movies and romance novels and a lot of folk tales too. Here's another one I think you'll recognize. This one starts way down on the misfortune side, And the worst of it is, it was a little girl, and she had lost her mother. And on top of that, her father had remarried this awful woman who had nasty, nasty daughters, and they treated her real mean. And they went off to the party all by themselves, but then her fairy godmother brought her clothes and shoes and transportation. And she went to the party and she danced with the prince, and she was so happy until the clock struck midnight and she had to leave. And she was afraid she'd never see him again. But luckily, he found the shoe, and you know that story, so she lived happy ever after. You notice at the beginning of the story, nothing's happening. This is where this is where you establish the characters, the setting, the time, but nothing's happening yet. And then one day, lost something, met something, heard about the party, etc. And then different actions happen in order to bring you to maybe a peak of happiness, but then maybe, oh dear, there's a fall. And hopefully we get back up again. Unfortunately, sometimes you hear some personal stories. Well, not on stage, fortunately, but oh, it's just awful. Everything's always awful. I can't pay my rent, and the dog is sick, and I've got a toothache, and it just kind of goes along, bless their heart. And that's a whole series of perhaps anecdotes about how those things happened, but it doesn't make a very compelling story. Or yes, I had a happy childhood and we had a dog, and he died, but we got another dog, and let me tell you, oh well, that one died, and then we had another dog, and I'll just tell you about every dog we ever had. And we had all these dogs, and they were all wonderful. And I don't doubt that that happened, but why am I hearing about that? What's the point? What was at stake? Did anything change? That's one of the differences, I would say, between a story and an anecdote, or a whole series of anecdotes. You see, they each one may have lots of facts, but remember, the facts are just bricks lying around. You have to shape them into a structured story to make them interesting. And the thing about Vonnegut's charts is that you notice all the changes, the ups and the downs, something at stake, something lost, something changing, and we hope something learned by the end of the story. We're going to practice some story structure analyses. We're going to map using this kind of a graph. Now, when you're in breakout rooms, I believe you will have the ability to put up a whiteboard, and you'll be able to mark it up, or just grab a piece of paper and you can do some drawing on the paper. What I'm going to do with you is tell you some stories that I think are fairly well structured. And then in your breakout rooms, I'll give you a few minutes to kind of sketch out a diagram, that kind of a graph diagram, to see how the story used its beginning, its middle, rising and falling, and its end. I'm going to start with a folktale, or my variation on a folktale. I think many of you will recognize the story. Actually, it's told worldwide, but the version I tell is informed by information that came from my father-in-law, who lived through the Depression and had things to say about it. Back in the 1930s, times were hard for everyone. Times were hard everywhere. Some men took to the rails looking for work, or they went on the road trying to find work. They were called hobos, these traveling fellas. Now, one day, a hungry hobo got off the train in a little town, And he headed into town hoping there was some work or maybe some food, even though all he had in his pockets was just 4 pennies. As he got into town, he smelled something wonderful. It was the smell of frying hamburgers. There was a hamburger stand outside on Main Street, and the wind was carrying that smell of frying meat to the nostrils of the hobo and everyone else on the sidewalk. Now, my father-in-law said back in the 30s, you could buy yourself a hamburger for 10 cents. And if you didn't have a dime, for 5 cents, you could buy yourself what they called a greasy, which was a hamburger bun grilled on the grill in the grease of the meat, so that when you ate it, it tasted a little bit like a hamburger. But as I said, this poor hobo, he just had 4 cents in his pocket. So he went into a back street to the back of a bakery. And sure enough, for 1 penny, he could buy a loaf of yesterday's stale bread. He took that loaf of bread and tore off a piece, and it was food, but it didn't taste like much. So he went back to the main street, remembering that the flavor of food isn't just from your tongue, it's from your sense of smell. He tore off another bite of bread and chewed it. And as he chewed it, he smelled the smell of those frying hamburgers. He could almost imagine he was eating one. That was good. Took another chunk. He was enjoying it so much he didn't notice that people were staring at him. He took another chunk. And he was grabbed by the arm. And the hamburger man was saying, "Hey, you! Hey, you're stealing!" And the hobo said, "Well, no, it's just me. I'm just eating my bread. I bought it. I bought this loaf of stale bread." And the hamburger man said, "No, but you're stealing the smell of my meat. Everybody's watching you. They're not buying hamburgers. It's your fault. I'm going to take you to the judge and make you pay." Well, they dragged him off before the judge, and the judge listened to what had been going on. And he turned to the hobo and said, "Okay, son, you got any money at all?" And the hobo fished in his pocket and brought out his last 3 cents. Judge said, "Give it here." What could the hobo do? A judge is a judge. But the judge took the 3 cents and held them in his hands. He said, "Okay, hamburger cooker," I've forgotten, give him a name. "Hamburger cooker, listen carefully. Ka-ching, 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 ka-ching. There, you have been paid with the sound of his money for the smell of your meat." Different versions of that story are told all over the world. My Japanese friend Hiroko Fujita told it about rice balls and the hungry farmer with his plain rice, eating his rice while he smelled the smell of unagi, grilled eels, coming down the street. Sometimes it's the smell of bread, but there are different ways of telling it, but I told it set into the 1930s. Okay, now think. The beginning of the story, where, when, and who was there. Nothing's happening yet. He just got off the train. He's hungry. Nothing's happening. But then he smelled the meat, and it was so tempting, but he didn't have 10 cents and he didn't have 5 cents. So he went on the back street to the back door of the bakery, and with 1 cent, remember he only had 4, with 1 cent, he bought a stale loaf of bread, and then went back on the main street and smelled the smell of the meat while he was eating his plain bread. How would you graph that story? Get a piece of scrap paper and let's see how you would graph that. Then the hamburger man grabbed him, dragged him to the judge, and the judge passed his judgment. If you've got a sketch, can you hold it up to your camera? Anybody got a sketch to hold up to their camera about what that structure would look like? Ah, uh-huh. Ken has one. Boy, he really plummeted down when he was dragged to the judge. And Hester has one. Jism, we're trying to get it to focus. Diane. Yeah, you can see, and it doesn't have to be just a straight line. It can have little bumps of one mouthful after another. But Lisbeth has him going up and getting, and then you can see the fall as everybody in gallery view, so you can see these different diagrams. And then with the, right. Rosemary has one. Okay. This is a way of looking for things that change in your story because that's what makes it interesting. If everything is just along at the same level, it's not really a story. It may be true anecdotes, but it doesn't grab us. We're looking for more of a change. Now let me give you an example of a fact tale, what I call a fact tale. When I research these stories, I often go out to the internet. Sometimes I have a whole packet of information that this is pages and pages that I looked up for one of my stories. But here, let me tell you one I developed just recently. I was a couple weeks ago, I was in Florida as part of a series of storytelling, all on each month. They brought in a different person to talk about sustainability. And I wanted a fact-based, person-centered story because I've taken Judith Black's workshops on how to make a compelling narrative out of facts. And an important thing, we humans, we like to hear about another human. And I happened to find this article in Solutions, which is the little newsletter of the Environmental Defense Fund. And I put together this story. So I want you to, this is all true. I researched it. I haven't been able to interview the guy myself. I tried to contact, but I did some more research in addition to the argument, in addition to the article. So listen to this and see how it follows that pattern. Mick Eskrick grew up in a dying town, Steelton, Pennsylvania. As you can tell from the name, it used to be a steel town. Way back after the Civil War, when Bethlehem Steel came in and built the town on the banks of the Susquehanna River. Mick's father and grandfather proudly told about how this town had grown from a handful of farm villages, a village of a handful of farm families, up to a mini metropolis with a main street lined with hotels and businesses. They had a big department store. They had grocery stores, post office, schools all around the countryside. They were so proud of Steelton. His father and grandfather raised their families working blue-collar jobs in the steel mills. You could do that then. But by the time Mick was born in the 1970s, a hurricane had come through and had wiped out the west side of town, and the steel mills were closing. Bethlehem Steel found that it was cheaper to get their steel made overseas. Each time the federal government did a census, they found that 25% of the population had left, and then another 25, and then another 25. Mick saw there was no future for him in the steel mills. Going to high school, playing football with his buddies, they looked past the field to a vacant lot, 5 acres, where the trash left over from the hurricane had been dumped. And then the rusted scrap from the steel mill was dumped. Fine thing for young people to grow up looking at the wreckage of what had been such a promising town. So Mick used his football scholarship to train as a teacher. And because he loved his town, he came back to Steelton. He taught in the Steelton schools, which by now were consolidated. All old school buses went around picking up the kids and bringing them into Steelton to the main buildings. The air was somewhat cleaner by then. Now that the steel mills were closed, they didn't have soot. It was possible you could hang your laundry outdoors now instead of hanging it on the clotheslines in the basement, now that you didn't have the soot. But asthma was still a problem. The diesel fumes belched by trucks going through town and by those old rundown school buses. Well, Mick worked his way up in the school system until he was superintendent. Some of his buddies were principals too, and a couple years ago they got together and they applied for a grant through the government process. I have to look up the name of the grant system, but they applied for a grant and they used the money to cover that 5-acre field of trash with photovoltaic cells. Solar energy. They made so much solar energy on those 5 acres, they powered all the school buildings and they had energy left over. The kids were so excited, the teachers began to teach math by figuring out how many days of full sunshine shining on this many solar panels producing that much wattage would power the kindergarten. They learned about electric cars, and some of the high school kids began designing them. They got really excited about photoelectricity, but that wasn't all. They built greenhouses heated by electricity. There was enough left over for some other houses as well. They built greenhouses because without grocery stores, Steelton had become kind of a food desert, and they really needed fresh produce for the school cafeteria. But not only that, Mick and his buddies got together and they put out another grant, and they got 6 electric school buses for the district. And now they don't have those diesel fumes pouring out and polluting the kids' lungs while the buses idle and wait and load and unload. Now, when the steamrollers, the Steelton Steamrollers, the football team, now when they go to a football game out of town, they arrive in the Cadillac of school buses. The town is looking after them and cares about them. Mick Eskrick said, "Look, it's not about you. It's not about me. It's about our kids. It's about their future." And that's the story of Steelton. Now, I took all the information that I looked up. I went online. It wasn't enough to just have the article that the Environmental Defense Fund had published. Here's the football team, here's the coach, here's the school bus, there's a picture of Mick. And they had a lot of information in that. But I made a photocopy, and you see I began highlighting information that was, and then I went online and I got the information about the population. I got the information about the buildings that they used to have on the main street, about the hurricane that had taken out the west side of town, about the jobs disappearing and the population. I went and got all of that. But how was I going to hang it together? And so I decided to use Mick as the needle in the haystack. I had a haystack of data, and I had to find the needle that was going to sew it together. We humans, we like to hear about another human. And so I followed Mick's family history, some of which I had to make up since I haven't been able to interview him directly. But I do know that he's been in Steelton for several generations. So his father and grandfather worked in the mills. And so I put it together that way. So you see, the beginning of the story tells you there he is, and it is sort of starting in the middle in the town that's already dying and had been dying. Then in the middle of the story, I was able to backfill some of where the town came from and how it had grown and then how it collapsed. And then I was able to take you back up again by telling how Mick loved the town and came back. And when he could get grants, he got the photo cells to cover that brownfield of wreckage with something positive, and how they could even power the electric school buses for the district. And then at the end, to tie it up, that is a direct quote from Mick Iskrick, and it's quoted in the article. It's not about me, it's not about you, it's about our kids, it's about their future. And I thought that made a nice way of tying it up. If you can, if you can make a closing, I don't want to call it a punchline, but something that wraps it up with a ribbon and ties a bow. A story is a gift that you give to other people. And so when you can put a bow on it and wrap it up neatly, I think that increases the effectiveness of the story. Well, I've been telling you a couple stories. I told a traditional type story. I told a crafted story. And I hope you've been thinking along. You can learn more and more by listening to other storytellers. When you're watching movies, look for the story structure. How does it grab your interest? How does it hold your interest? Where does it take you? What are you curious about? How do they answer that? As you've been listening to my stories, I hope you've been thinking about the structure, because now it's your turn. I'm going to put you back into breakout rooms, and I'm going to try, let's see, we have 26 people, so I'll put you in smaller groups so that you have fewer people. I want you to think about a story that you tell. It could be a traditional folk tale. It could be, well, Itsy Bitsy Spider. How about that? He went up the water spout, down came the rain and washed him out, and then the sun, and he went up again. Could be a traditional story. It could be a family story. What is the structure of your family story? How would you structure that? So I'm going to put you in breakout rooms again, and I'm going to try to divide it. No, how do we, well, recreate. Let's see, can I do that? Okay, I want actually in and out of several of the breakout rooms. I'm afraid I should have written a slide with the directions or put it all in the chat or something like that. But I think most of you ultimately found a story of your own from your own repertory. family or personal story, fictional story, traditional tale, or one of the fact-based genres. And I challenged you to come up with a diagram of it to see whether you had that undulation in the middle that said something was at stake, something was lost, something was happening, and not just and then. I've heard some structure of story called there was so and so and so and so and so and so and so, which leaves me saying, so what? That's the
So and so.
yeah. I'd like a little bit more at stake in terms of drama and things, and that's where Kurt Vonnegut's style of diagramming may help you to see where you need to maybe put more at stake. For instance, in many traditional versions of the theft of smell story that I told you, the issue is resolved between, say, the hobo and the hamburger man. And the hobo just shakes his coins and said, well, buddy, I'm going to give you the sound of my money because all I took was the smell of your meat. And there was no judge involved. But my dear advisor, Ken Ogus, pointed out that it would be more fraught with tension if he was actually dragged before a judge and thought he was going to really lose his money. And so I put the judge in, and judges do appear in many versions of the story. Well, I saw some people holding up good-looking charts. Is there one from your group? Is there somebody who would like to volunteer? Hold your hand up. I mean, do the hand raise deal so that I can see you. And then I'll know that somebody's ready to volunteer and share something with us. And by the way, if you have questions, somebody wrote in the chat, who was the name of that storyteller I mentioned who had such well-shaped stories? Donald Davis. He was featured at the Texas Festival last year. And so his recordings are on the Tejas website. I I should think, and you can watch those. There are other recordings of Donald Davis, but it's worth a study because he really knows how to shape a story to catch our interest, hold our interest, make us care, and then finally take us home with a good ending. Any volunteers from your group? Any questions? I don't see any. I don't see any hands up yet. Hands up? Anybody? Ah, okay. Ken raised his hand and he's got a chart for what story is this?
Tax time. I finished now. I finished filling out my taxes a couple of years ago and decided to reward myself. So I'm a little below the happiness level until I get my taxes done. I drive off to deliver them to the post office in person. But after I do that, I think I'm going to reward myself by buying some used DVDs at a bargain store. I go to the store, pick out the DVDs, and I discover my wallet is not in my pocket. And so, what have I done? I go out to the car. It's not there either. I left it home. So I go back into the store thinking this is the right thing to do. I tell them, I forgot my wallet. You know, you don't have to hold on to these for me. I have to go home now. And there's a fellow waiting in line with a whole stack of DVDs to say, hey, I'll buy those two for you. And you don't have to do that. No, I insist it's my birthday. So he buys my DVDs and then we stand around chatting afterward. And my conclusion that I shared with Donna was that sometimes if you allow someone to do an act of kindness for you, you're more apt to turn around and do an act of kindness for someone else. But that disappointment of not having the wallet, but all of a sudden it's because of a nice stranger.
Very nice. Thank you. Thank you. Diane. Diane has a hand up. She's volunteering. Thank you, Ken.
Here.
Let's
Okay.
spotlight
Um,
Diane.
I told, I have my tablet upside down, so I have to be I have to manhandle it. I told the story of how the leprechauns came to be in Ireland, and it all starts out with the leprechauns up in heaven with God and all the angels, and then Lucifer and his gang decide that they're gonna, want to have a takeover. So there's a battle going on, and both sides come to the king of the leprechauns and say, fight it, help us fight. And he says, no, 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 we're neutral. This goes on until, well, the battle's over. Lucifer and his gang are kicked out, and everything seems like it's going to be well. But then God calls the king of the leprechaun into his throne room, or calls him to visit him, and he says, "You can't stay here." And oh no, why can't we stay here? We didn't help the other side. Well, you didn't help us. He said, so because you didn't help them, I'll let you choose where you're going to go. And so he parted the clouds, and they looked down on the earth, and the king of the leprechauns saw this little jewel, a green jewel in the ocean, and they decided to be on the Emerald Isle.
Lovely, lovely. Thank you. So we've had a personal story and we've had a folk tale about leprechauns. I don't see any other brave. Oh, there, Elizabeth has her hand up. Let's see, we can.
Sorry, I'm on my tablet and I can't find the hand thing.
Okay.
But this is a story I wrote called No Ordinary Quest. And it's about a young knight who goes out on a quest, but he's not looking for normal things. And he says he doesn't want to rescue maidens in distress, and he certainly has no intentions of whacking any dragons. But because he'd seen so much war and fighting in his young life, he was looking for a kind heart, maybe a loyal heart, maybe even a loving heart. So he sets out, and, in 3 days, of course, he finds that kind heart and leaves. And then 3 days later, finds that loyal heart. And he's so deep in thought when he hits the forest, he's not paying attention and doesn't realize the forest has gone deathly quiet, and he's attacked by a fire-breathing dragon and survives because there was a young man, he thought, in the forest who saved him, took him to the village. And it turns out it wasn't a young man, it was a young woman, the healer in the village. And as he's there healing, he bit by bit falls in love with the fair maiden McKenna, and he realizes he's found his loving heart,
Aw.
and they live happily ever after.
Oh, very sweet and original
Yeah.
fiction. Very nice. Well, you
Thank
have
you.
time. Hester Moore has something, and we have a couple minutes, and we want to hear from
Okay.
Hester.
All right. Okay. Right there.
Uh-huh.
So real quickly,
Oh,
okay, can you see it?
yes.
Yep.
Okay. So one day I was on the porch with my sister. We were having a great, great time. It was, really nice Saturday. And but at some point, there was a neighbor that was passing by as we were on the porch, and his name was Mr. McGee. Mr. McGee was a striking sanitation worker. I would wish that I could help him because he looked so distraught. When I spoke to him, he barely spoke. And when he walked off, I just really felt bad for him because I felt like I wanted to help, but I was 16 years old. Well, the story goes up because at some point, when Dr. King decided he wanted to come and support the sanitation workers, he said he wanted more young people to participate. This is my opportunity. So as you can see, the graph goes up. But he said that we had to go through a training, a nonviolent training. We could not wait for Dr. King to show up. But unfortunately, that particular day, a riot broke out and we were devastated. But one thing that I do know, we were hymned in a church. We were all crying. The policemen told us to come out. I was very angry. I was very upset. But I remember when I walked home, I remember over and over in my head the song that they taught us during the workshop was that we needed to keep our eyes on the prize. And I just thought about that when I was sitting on a porch, no matter how upset that I was, no matter what had happened during that particular day, we had to keep our eyes on the prize. And the prize were to help these sanitation workers get off strike. And no matter what happened, love oversees and love never fails if we keep our eyes on the prize.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And that was very dramatic, up and down. You could see how that works. And
Thank you.
so that chart is especially helpful for the middle of the story to make sure things are happening, things are changing. But you also heard some good beginnings, nothing much happening, but it took us in, and some very nice endings that wrapped it up and tied it up. I wish that when I'm listening to open mics, I occasionally wish that more people understood that an anecdote may have happened, but that doesn't mean it's a story. It's not a story unless something changes, something happens, something is lost or found, or something is learned. That's what we humans believe in cause and effect. Scientists don't always find it, but we believe in it. And so if you can put together a story that shows what led to something happening and what happened as a result, that's the kind of story people want to listen to. I want to thank you for coming this evening. I want to thank TSA for putting this on. I want to thank you all for coming. And I want to advise you that none of this works unless you do. It's your job now to listen to good storytellers and consciously, as you're listening, here's the beginning. How did they structure the middle? Here's the ending. Storytellers always steal ideas from each other, and that's, storytelling really isn't taught, it's caught. And you have to, contact is essential for contagion. You have to listen to the good storytellers. Go to the TSA website, look at their recordings, look at the stories that were recorded there, and model your stories on that. It doesn't have to be chronological beginning, middle, and end. You can mess with it. Lauren Nemi has written an entire book of alternate plots, which will work for some audiences, but not for all of them because they can't always follow it when it goes that way. I have one last slide for you. I'm gradually learning how to do this. Here we go. All right.
Fran, will you take a few questions when
I
we're
will
done?
indeed.
Okay, thank you.
Here's the last slide that I thought you would enjoy. And this is a reference to the hero's journey structure, which does a good job of covering Star Wars and Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz and a number of other plans, but it doesn't it's not flexible enough to cover all of the kinds of stories. So, are there questions about story structure? Because
Yeah.
as I said, I can't cover
If
everything.
you have them, you can write them in chat and then I can relay them to to Fran if you'd like to do it that way.
Someone asked the title of the story about the hamburger, and that is The Theft of Smell is the generic title. There are many versions worldwide of that kind of a story. see. Well, lovely comments. I don't see.
Lovely, lovely comments and all true. And these master classes are a pretty marvelous series. I mean, I always felt that they were going to be wonderful, but these are frankly much better than I ever dreamed because we get to know each other in a different way. It's not a matter of just sitting here and listening to each other tell stories. That's good enough. But to listen to our insights and ideas and knowledge is extraordinarily powerful. I know I speak for everyone when I say that, but Fran, this was honestly a great, great masterclass. It was useful. You did things with us instead of just doing things to us, and I really appreciated that very, very much. Uh, is
Hank, I got
there?
a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, question.
Uh, Fran, you were showing us all the documentation that you had for the story that was factual. Do you do that with all of your stories? Do you have like a catalog or a file cabinet of, you know,
I do for the folk tales. I keep records of what books I found it in. I look them up in the folklore index and find out if there are alternate versions. I try to have more than one version of a folk tale before I tell it because sometimes, especially the picture book versions, have a lot of original creative detail that was added by the latest teller, and that stuff is copyrighted. But the bones of the story, you can back calculate what the bones are if you find several versions and compare them. And then you can go and copyright your own version if you want to. As for the fact tales, yes, I do research them. I guess this one that I wrote up years ago was about the demons of Mali, about I found an interesting article in Science News magazine, and I thought, is that true? And I researched it, and I got geology references, and then I had the challenge of putting it together as a tellable story. So I try to keep those things in file folders and index cards so that I can go back and know where they came from. Now the questions are coming.
it
All right,
seems like
Chester.
that might be one of the dividing lines between professionals and just those of us who just try to tell stories. Because I've heard a whole lot of other professionals say that they do that same kind of thing, have some kind of method of categorizing and keeping track of it. And
And then having grown up telling folk tales where the characters are the farmer, the girl, when I have a real story and I really need to remember the proper name of a person and where they were and the dates, that's why I've got to have documentation because I've got to have that handy to go back to. And my Lord, when I tell the Greek myths, I better go back and look up all those names. Donna had her hand up.
Yeah, I was going to say this has been really helpful, and what you just touched on that, as far as getting the documentation and having a file, I think that would be a very helpful class in for those of us who haven't written books or gone through that kind of training. The organization of getting the facts and putting that together. I really enjoyed Charlotte Lake Alston's class, the master class, and it touched on that as well. This might be something that would be good for a future training. I would like it.
Thank you. Chester?
Yeah, on your story about the steel town, what is the line? I often run into very interesting stories I find in magazines. Now, in that case, you obviously did traditional research, but what is that line between being able to tell that story and being able to not steal from somebody else's work? Steel's a little strong on that, but how do you handle that?
Well, for instance, I did directly quote Mick Iskrick, and I got the quote from the article, the little closing lines that I used about it's not about me, it's not about you, that was a direct quote. The information about the history of the town, I looked that up on the town's website. I looked up the history of Bethlehem Steel, and I checked about, just how bad off was the town from the time when it was in its heyday to the time when Mick was growing up in the 70s and things were falling apart. Now, I wish I could talk to him directly to find out, okay, he came back to town as a teacher, and I think somewhere it said that he taught high school science. Did he also coach football? Because football seems to be a theme in there. Did he go to college on a football scholarship? I'd like to be able to fill that in. I haven't been able to talk to him directly.
Well, do you have a general rule that you kind of follow, ethical rule? Because I know you to be a very ethical person. So I know you have some in your head, you have some ethical rules about doing that sort of thing, creating something from other
Well,
sources.
yeah, I'm afraid I kind of dance on the edge when it comes to making up biographical details for a character when I haven't been able to get them myself. I make all the efforts I can to try to find out. But you're right. I am a little nervous not knowing exactly what he felt about a particular thing. And so it is historical fiction, shall we say, to put it together.
Thank you.
Judith Black does wonderful, very dramatic stories about issues, especially environmental issues, and she tells them in first person as a fictional character. And the problem with that is, even if you tell your audience this is historical fiction, the facts of the matters, they're all true, but the character I'm portraying is a fictional composite. And people who do historical reenactment run into that too. Even when you tell them up front and maybe even tell them at the end, they come up later and they say, "Oh, I just loved your family story. That was so." What can you do?
Let's just take one more question. It's a little after 9 o'clock, and I
Yep.
don't want us to take advantage of our instructors because it's exhausting to do this. Ken, you have your hand up?
Sure. And actually, what I have is kind of a comment on Chester's question. I think, Chester, that when journalists do their job well and they provide us with a story that is not only interesting and catches our attention and teaches us something and makes us curious about the real world, to find out that someone like Fran Stallings is telling people about the story she read, not pretending that it's her original creation, for journalists to know that their story was interesting enough that people are telling it to each other, that's a sign of success, right? So we're all looking for those good success stories that we can share, that are supply people with hope, and give us an example of what people can do when they get together and work cooperatively.
That's a
I've,
great point.
yeah.
That's a great point. Fran, thank you so much for your time and preparation. Remember, we have these every month, or Thursday of every month. Be sure to register and be sure to take part as much as you possibly can. We appreciate it because we know you've got lives too. So every time you spend time with TSA, we are highly appreciative, very much so. So I leave you, and remember.
One word of advice.
Okay.
Save the chat. It has some interesting comments and some some
Okay.
sources.
Keith, did you hear that? Because I have no idea how to do that.
Guys, go open the chat window, and up at the
Yeah,
top,
got
there's
it.
an X, there's a box, there's 3 dots.
Yes, great idea, Fran. Thank you. All right, everybody. It's never too late to live happily ever after. So have a wonderful, wonderful evening, and we hope to see you real soon. God bless.